My grandfather fought the Nazi occupation in Denmark during World War II. My father was a career officer in the Danish army, in the Hussars regiment, and that regiment became my life and my family. I was brought up with the idea that honor and glory was won in wartime and in battle. And I was taught that the only wars that the Danish army and the Danish state would ever fight would only be the good ones. I was also told that during the Cold War, NATO was the last line of defense against an aggressive Eastern Bloc with the leadership of the Soviet Union. And when my government and my army told me that we were going to Iraq to fight for democracy and to fight for the Iraqis, I answered their call. I volunteered and I was ready to die for the case. The honorable goal of helping the Iraqi people. There was just one slight catch. They lied. The classical Western European democratic nation of fighting for democracy and peace, and the idea that this fight is honorable is wrong. These simple phrases about fighting for democracy and for freedom are extensively used by exactly those people who themselves have never, nor ever will, fight for anybody but themselves. These phrases are worn out by politicians and senior military personnel and political commentators and analysts, and none of them have ever seen nor smelled a battlefield. They have not felt the fear under fire from a hidden enemy or the fear of the explosions from IEDs. No senior military personnel, no Danish army, and no politicians fight for democracy in Denmark. Neither does they fight for the Iraqis or the Afghans. They only fight for themselves. They fight for the next step up the social, the political, or the career ladder. They fight for new extensive funds for highly modern fighter jets, or they fight for the adrenaline kick that is gained only in a firefight in a foreign country. The enemy on the battlefield is whoever the army chooses to fight, and it might even be the same innocent civilians who the army in the first place was sent to protect. If it helps the army, and if it helps the politicians to gain their main objective, good press and public backing. When I was serving in Iraq in 2004 under British command, I was approached by my commanding officer, a colonel. He wanted to execute a military search and arrest operation in the biggest, nearest town to our base, which was Abu-Jamal. He approached me with intelligence, suggesting that Al-Qaeda operatives and the leaders of the Iraqi insurgency was present in this town. Abu-Jamal was my responsibility as an intelligence officer, and I knew that town for being there for 4 months every day. I dismissed his intelligence as fabricated, and I said that his targets would most likely only be civilians. I warned him that he might be used in a sectarian operation conducted by the Shia-led army. He insisted on conducting the operation, himself wanting to gain a reputation as a battlefield commander and a modern leader of men. In my part of the operation, I made the orders concerning the intelligence, and I directly warned my commanding officer and my colleagues that they had to remember that the people in the targets would most likely be civilians, but they all ignored this. And when these newly formed Iraqi security forces, which were very much infiltrated by Shia militias, began to beat up these detainees in the early morning hours in Asubaya, my colleagues did not intervene nor stop the abuse. When I told my commanding officer and showed him a videotape which was recorded during the operation by my colleagues, he told me not to rock the boat. He said that the responsibility for a Danish withdrawal from Iraq only a month prior to the first national elections would be mine, if I should choose to inform Danish High Command. In the days to follow, he launched a media campaign where he told the Danish public about the success of this wonderful operation in Iraq, and the then Danish Prime Minister, Mr. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the now leader of NATO, announced the Danish forces in Iraq as a success. At the same time as they were both smiling to cameras in Denmark, the detainees who were taken to the infamous torture center Abu-Jamal in Basra were tortured harsh for 70 days. When local Iraqi media broke the story about the abuse witnessed by Danish officers, my colleagues wrote falsified reports, and Mr. Anders Fogh Rasmussen stepped forward and denounced Iraqi media as liars. He refused to undertake an investigation, and doing this, he himself chose to violate international human law. A law that calls for any nation to immediately instigate quick and thorough investigations by suspicion of torture. And since then, the Danish government and the Danish army have used every possible asset in their attempt to stop the Iraqis to bring their case for the courts and to justice in Denmark. In 2010, I learned about the attempts for the Iraqis to gain some justice, and I chose to step forward as a witness to help their case. I was still thinking that the army would do the right thing. When I met the lawyer, I was shockingly aware of the lies that my government had sent him, and they denied everything. I was shocked. My world crumbled. I chose to rock the boat, and I stepped forward with the recorded video file. I was immediately ousted and called a liar publicly by my former commanding officer, by the commander of defense in Denmark, and by the Danish Minister of Defense. However, the evidence was very clear. The video file showed the case, showed the abuse. And as an attempt to shut me and other potential witnesses down, the army chose to prosecute me and no one else, claiming that things had happened too long ago and that the case could not be brought to justice. The Danish High Court decided that I had no right to legal representation, no right to see the evidence held by the army, which I knew would tell the truth about what I have seen, and they sentenced me. No other charges were filed against anyone else, not my commanding officer, not my colleagues, nor the present or any of the former Minister of Defense in Denmark. Since then, I have lost my job as a career officer in the army. I've lost most of my friends and my social network. I have lost most of my family, who are either army officers or policemen. and I have received many death threats against me and my children, foremost from former colleagues in the army. But I have regained my self-respect, and I got a new understanding of the word truth. The enemy was not the one that I was taught. The enemy was the very same people that I was ready to die for. The enemy, the one I was told was bad, showed to be the only people that I have ever met who does not compromise on truth, however unpleasant it might be. And this whole experience opened my eyes to a truth that I just did not want to face, because it meant that everything I held sacred and trusted was false. I was only left with my core values, started a new life, a new beginning, got some new friends, and a brand new and much better family, you. The road that I have traveled towards the truth was way too long, and initiatives such as the Rosa Luxemburg Conference is necessary, both now and in the future. In terms of getting the right perspective on the use of war as a means of getting small political gains despite its huge human costs. I think that Rosa Luxemburg might agree with me when I say that there is no glory nor honor in war, in any war. And I will no longer take any orders from anybody, from no ruling class. I will insist on making up my own mind. Thank you.
Okay, would you like to present yourself and where do you come from, and would you like to say something about your personal situation?
Thank you. I'm Napoli Paul Langer from Sudan. I don't want to say south or north, I'm a Sudanese. This is also the European, when they came during the colonization and imperialism, they scattered us and they planned us hatred and all these kind of things. So that's why I call myself, I'm a Sudanese. What I like to say is that we are in European countries, not only Germany. I'm talking about the refugees in Western world. translation?
Also sie hat gesagt, dass sie aus dem Sudan kommt. Okay, super. You can speak.
Okay, thank you. The refugees in Western world, they are not feeling home. They are not welcome. We are not feeling normal. We are going as if we are squeezed. We came to Western world. We left our right where you came. Some people who are coming through Libya, they left their right in Libya. They came here naked without anything. We are still practicing the imperialism. We are still in Western world practicing the colonization time. We are still living the past. We are not living the present. We are still remembering what our grandfathers, our grandmothers were practicing because they were slaves. I'm the daughter of the slave, of the granddaughter of the slave, and the daughter of refugees. And today I'm refugees. And tomorrow my daughter, my son will be refugees. Are we here to do all these things? Are we here? Are we deserve? Some people deserve to be refugees. Because even the name of refugees destroy our names. We have names. We are human beings. I always say, if we are not together to support one another, the problem will go from one another to today Western world will be, tomorrow you will see the Africa will also be. Now the things are like this. It was the Soviet Union, and now it's America. Tomorrow it will be Asia. After tomorrow it will be Africa. Why don't we come close to one another? Why we are having this kind of, the name refugees, and everybody seeing me like refugees, and then they say, oh, refugees. No, it's not good. Refugees is lazy. Refugees has nothing to do. Drug dealers. Drinking. Why not? I will be drug dealer. I will drink too. I will do all this. If I cannot allow to work, to practice my whatever, to feel who I am, why not? I will do it. But if there is a work that I can feel home, I can work myself, I pay the whatever pay. I will have no time to sell the drugs. I will have no time to drink. I will have no time to do all this. I will see my future. But if my future is blocked, to say is, you brothers, don't practice the dictatorship I was practicing. We have to realize that enough is enough. It's time to come together and practice together and feel, because this world is our world. It's like house for me, it's like house. And brothers, where do you want me to go? Where? We have to remember also what made me to come here. Everybody feel home. Nobody will forget home, where he was or he is. But we have to call where you are, and to need, you need safetyness, you have to call second home, and you welcome by your brothers until you go on your leg anymore or feet. And thank you very much. The people want to talk, sorry.
Zettel gereicht bekommen, dass eine Theaterperformance im Anschluss stattfindet. Weg zur Einbürgerung vor der Orania, Gruppe Refugees vom Oranienplatz. Hakim möchte jetzt auch noch was sagen. Do you speak English also? Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm Mahdi. I'm also from Sudan, where Nablus comes from. I arrived at Oranienplatz at the end of October 2012. I'm native from Oranienplatz, and I would like to start from Nablus' point that how we are facing a neo-colonial, and I would like to talk in a minute about resident village. It's one of our main demands. And when I go back to Sudan, and the reason why I left Sudan, after I got released from the prison, I had to go every Thursday at 12 o'clock and do a signature, which is kind of resident village too. And when I came to Oranienplatz, I learned that the resident village is actually designed as a colony law. The German colony, they've done it in Namibia before. The Namibian people were not allowed to move from city to another without permission. And the English colony, they've done it in Sudan. The southern people where Nablus come from were not allowed to come to north as well as northern to South Sudan. And that's why we had one of the longest wars in Africa. That's why now it's South Sudan and North Sudan. And when we had to flee our countries, we still facing the same resident village and the same old laws. And very briefly, because of time, what I learned from Oranienplatz, I never learned in the school, I never learned in the university. I learned on Oranienplatz what politics mean and how politics work. I learned in Oranienplatz what capitalism means. I learned in Oranienplatz what NATO means. I learned in Oranienplatz how EU and American, how they support our dictatorship, how they support our dictatorship instead of supporting democracy in our country. Thank you so much.
Thank you a lot for coming on this stage.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, comrades and friends. And those who are friends, I hope you'll be comrades later. I'm waiting for my computer to wake up so I can remember what to say to you. Oh, I'm not too far from the microphone. I've been given a task that should take a series of lectures to talk about imperialist wars and Africa. If you think about my trip from Cape Town to Berlin, I think 10 hours of the 12 hours of flying were over Africa and only 2 hours over the Mediterranean Sea and Germany. So it's quite a big country, a big continent. And I know that people in Europe think that Africa is a continent of black people and black people all think alike because they're black, you know. It's an absurdity, and this is part of the racism with which people in Europe and America who have written the history of the world talk to us and try to explain things. That there are differences between African people, different interests, different climates, different resources, different possibilities, doesn't seem to matter to people in Europe. And we in Africa, we say, we're a bunch of racists, you know. I mean, nobody in Europe will talk about white-on-white wars in Germany or in Europe, a 30 years war, a 60 years war, World War I, World War II. You don't explain it in these simple racial terms as though skin color and the brain have some connection. You understand I'm a little bit passionate about this subject. And I want to quickly draw a distinction in my response to the title, Imperialist Wars and Africa. I'm opposed to imperialist wars in Africa and Asia and Latin America and anywhere. But I'm not opposed to wars of liberation. It would be an absurdity, since I was the weapons maker for our underground army, or rather I would have been if I hadn't been arrested too early. Why? Because I believe in justice, I believe in equality, and I believe there are times when tyrants have to be overthrown in the interest of peace and justice, not because I love war and violence, which I don't like at all. I don't know what's happening to my computer, it's gone to sleep. I have to start somewhere, and of course I could start with the colonial conquest around about 1500, the taking of slaves. We know the Middle Passage, how many hundreds of thousands and millions of people who died, to build America, to enrich Europe in their triangular trade. But I have to start somewhere, so I'm going to start with the Berlin Conference at the end of the 19th century, when the big powers, Britain, France, Germany, carved up Africa. They'd seized colonies, and it was interesting, you know, because capitalism requires a free labor force. It requires some form of democracy, they say. But when it comes to Africa, African countries, people, resources were treated like commodities to be exchanged. And so they created, through the Berlin Conference and other treaties, a kind of international law based on feudal ideas of ownership of people and lands and resources. It's rather strange, I think, and shows the immorality and the backward-looking nature of capitalism and imperialism, if you think about human beings as being the key to it all, which capitalists and imperialists don't think about at all. What they think about is profit. So the Berlin Conference was an attempt to stave off war and conflict between these powers, as each needed to find markets, raw materials, and cheap human resources to keep their system going. The English historian and economist John Hobson in 1902 wrote his book, Imperialism, a Study. He compiled the statistics of trade, the major powers, and the accumulation of capital and the bringing together of capital through banking institutions and industrial capital to create a new kind of set of relationships, where with the increasing technology and skills built up during the 19th century, they could produce so much and had no markets for them. Where to find new markets? In the colonies. Where to find the raw materials? In the colonies. Where to find the outlets for their capital? In the colonies. And so instead of just exporting commodities, goods, manufactured goods, they started exporting the capital as well. Lenin called this finance capital. After all, when you lent money to a colony, whether India or Nigeria or South Africa or any other colony, it was to buy goods. So the capitalist class in your home country made profit out of selling the goods. And then you lent them the money to pay for the goods and made even more profit out of the interest on the loan. And often the loan didn't go to the country at all. It just stayed in the home country to pay for the railway lines and the locomotives and the rolling stock and the signalling gear, which enabled them to penetrate these countries. It's rather strange. It goes on today, you know. You realize that, of course. Germany lent billions to Greece to pay for frigates and submarines which they didn't need. None of the money went to Greece. So we might say the more things change, the more they stay the same when it comes to finance capital. It's a period Lenin defined as a period of monopoly capital, of dividing up the world between companies and, how can I put it? In America today, 1% of the population takes home 20% of the income of the country. 1%. Can you imagine this? What's the proportion in Germany amongst the wealth and the ever worsening position of working people in Germany? These patterns go on, and in Africa even more intensely. And so we have to ask, what was it all about? Imperial wars were about exploitation and control. I said the Berlin Conference was to try to stop the war, to achieve a kind of settlement between the big powers. But just to give one example, France sent troops into Morocco to put down an uprising. This was against international treaties, so Germany sent a warship, a gunboat, to Agadir. The Panther was its name. And so there was a confrontation and close to war between France and Germany over the colonies. Well, they settled it, and how did they settle it? France stayed in Morocco with its troops and gave Germany part of its Congo colony. Didn't ask the people of the Congo. Just gave them the people and the land and the resources. Of course, this didn't stop the war. Eventually it did break out. It is said that it was the murder of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, but in fact the first shots were fired in Togo and in Dar es Salaam in East Africa, as the British tried to undermine the naval bases of the German naval fleet. Because in those days the technology was world control, world powers through powerful navies. And if you don't have a coaling station, ships can't function. That was the start of World War I in reality. And so we see that really the conflict was about European quest for power and control in the interest of their ruling classes, of monopoly capital, and the African people paid for it. But the number of soldiers that were recruited and died in World War I was enormous. The British recruited soldiers on a massive scale. What's happening here? Recruited soldiers on a massive scale, conscripted soldiers on a massive scale, and many died, fighting not only in Europe, but fighting in Africa. This European war also took place in East Africa, in West Africa, in Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, as they fought out who was going to control the world. The effects were quite powerful because African soldiers came back to nothing, were poorly paid, died in war, but also of disease and lack of care. Imagine being taken from tropical West Africa to fight a war in winter in Europe, in ice and snow, without proper equipment, and then being told you're not a good soldier. Why should people fight for people they don't respect? Except that they get punished if they don't fight. The loss of human life was like that of the loss of the most physically powerful and capable through slavery. The effects go on for generations. But at the same time, African people began to say, why should we be suffering this? Why should we be exploited? And so there emerged a Pan-Africanist movement, led at first by W.E.B. Du Bois, an American Marxist who convened the first conference in London in 1906. And there were a series of conferences. These conferences made ever increasing demands for equal rights. At the same time, the wars and the exploitation continued. You know the phrase that the Congo, from the novel by Joseph Conrad, a Polish sea captain, settled in England, wrote the most wonderful literature, and wrote about the Congo as a heart of darkness, the very worst aspect of imperialism, under King Leopold of Belgium, eventually taken over by the Belgian state, the utmost brutality. And we see the consequences today of a people divided, crushed, demoralized, and set one against the other, one group against another. It goes on and on. It's still a heart of darkness. It is still a heart of darkness. And it's not as though with the liberation of the countries of Africa after World War II, and World War II, war was fought in Africa and Asia and all over the world to settle these old imperialist scores for control and power. It goes on today. Indirectly, the exploitation continues. The exploitation continues. I'm from South Africa, as you know, and I have to say that perhaps since we were the last of the colonies to be liberated in the formal sense of the word, there was this huge number of countries after World War II, Ghana, Nigeria, and you can name them all, Kenya and various others, who achieved their freedom in the formal sense and ended up being exploited in a time of neo-colonialism through finance capital. We lend you money, we compel you to pay. The product you sell us earns you less than the interest you pay us. So your countries get poorer and poorer and poorer. This is the reality of Africa today. South Africa, to go back a bit, took 100 years for the British to conquer South Africa and Southern Africa. The people resisted until 1906, when the Zulu chief Bambata was finally executed, and the British, being very civilized, cut off his head and paraded it around the countryside to show that you do not mess with British imperialism and finance capital. But the consequence was the formation of the African National Congress. People didn't give up wanting their freedom and organizing for it. And so politically people struggled, demanded independence. I'm going to leap forward to the end of World War II, or during World War II, when Churchill and Roosevelt met to proclaim the war aims of the Western Allies against Nazi Germany, the Axis powers, together with Italy and militarist Japan. And they said the aim was the end of colonialism, equal rights for all people. I don't think they really meant it, but they said it, because they needed the support of the peoples of the colonies to fight their wars and to die. And those who got home got a bicycle, white soldiers got a pension, their families got medical care for life. Those who died, black soldiers, got nothing. The raw materials that were taken from their countries to enable the war to continue between the Western powers were never really paid for. Their lands were robbed, their peoples were robbed, and their people died. To sustain capitalism, and in South Africa, a group of young black South Africans formed the African National Congress Youth League, talking about Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, people whose names, if you follow South African recent history, are quite famous. And they said, if you're talking about equality, then we want equality for our people as well. At first they said, we want freedom for African people and everybody else must get out. And then realized that that's not equality. And so within the African National Congress, there emerged a dominant thread of politics, which emerges into our Freedom Charter by 1955, which says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white together. Now that's quite a remarkable thing when the majority of the people are oppressed, have no political rights, no trade union rights, and yet through thousands of meetings put forward their proposals for this Freedom Charter, which was not written by a few academics or politicians. It really came out of the people themselves. It was the first political campaign I was involved in as a young man. And really and truly, our people showed such generosity to the oppressor to say, if you will accept the idea of equality, you have a place. In other words, the sophisticated concept that we fight against white supremacy, not against whites because they're white, because we reject racism. It's a very sophisticated concept, and our people followed it and followed it today, and that's the position of the African National Congress and our Constitution and what we fought for. So the reaction of the majority of South Africans, black, some white, but also we talk of national minorities called coloured and Indian, and whites are also a national minority, support this idea. You could have thought they would want revenge. This was done to us, we're going to do it to everybody else. We've resisted it, often with great difficulty, because there are always people who want for themselves and not for others, don't want to share. I was in the trial with Nelson Mandela. We were on trial for our lives. Nelson Mandela explained to the court why he had taken part and helped to form this armed wing of the African National Congress, of our liberation movement, called the Spirit of the Nation, or as you said, Program Director, Umkhonto weSizwe, the Zulu word for the Spirit of the Nation. And he ended his speech, very famous line. It was a 4-hour speech. He described the politics of it and the reasons for calling for the armed struggle. And he said, all his life, he'd fought against white domination and he'd fought against black domination. His ideal was a society, he said, in which people could live together in harmony. It was an ideal, he said, he hoped to live to see achieved. We were on trial for our lives, you understand. But if needs be, he said to the judge, and to white South Africa, and to the world, if needs be, it's an ideal for which he was prepared to die. What a moment. What a moment of elegance, of strength, of commitment. Not just words. This was a leader who led from the front, with his comrades in the dock with him, and those outside, and saying to the judge, hang me if you dare to. Oh, by the way, hang Walter, hang Dennis, hang Walter, all of them. And what I remember is just a moment of elation to share this moment. Turning point in my life, I have to say, and all of ours. We fully expected to be hanged. We saw very little chance of survival. And you know, if you take up arms against a very powerful military state, chances of survival are not great. They really are not great. But then in the end, the judge found us guilty of a conspiracy to overthrow the state by force of arms, to receive an army of invasion. They meant soldiers we'd sent out to training would come back again. And then, you know, I did something terribly bad. I bought a Volkswagen Kombi bus so that I could drive my comrades around in secret. White boy, curtains, my black comrades in the back, absolute safety, you know. I got a life sentence for buying that Volkswagen Kombi. I don't buy Volkswagen now. Got to have a joke here now and then, you know. And other things, spending money, doing things for our movement. So we ended up found guilty of 4 charges. And the judge said the appropriate sentence is the death sentence. And then he said, but we were not charged with high treason, and so he could afford to be a little lenient. Just a little bit, and we began to smile a bit, because no death sentence. And then he said, life sentence on each charge. And so we had 4 life sentences. But I want to reassure you, because you only serve 1 life, you know. So it's not so long after all. And we laughed, because life is wonderful. It truly is. Well, I was released after 22 years, and then my other comrades, and Nelson Mandela after 27 years altogether in prison. And comes out of prison upholding the idea that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Now that he's passed away, people are saying, what changed him? What changed him was that he stayed absolutely true to the principles we announced when we took up arms. The answer was not to kill every soldier or to drive people into the sea. It was to achieve our goal of South Africa belonging to all who live in it, black and white together. And so when we took up the arms, we issued a manifesto, actually signed by Nelson Mandela as the Commander-in-Chief, but anonymously, of course. And what it said was, in effect, our people will build the power to seize power, but better that we negotiate a political settlement of the representation of all our people in political equality, so we can have social and economic equality over time. In other words, a war is not over when every soldier is dead. It's over when the state can no longer continue. It took 30 years for them to agree to negotiate. 30 years. A lot of people died. At least 1,000 people were extrajudicially murdered. At least 100 were judicially executed. Tens of thousands of years of prison time by so many of our comrades, including young children as young as 8 years old, sentenced to prison for throwing a stone at an armoured vehicle and damaging state property. That's the kind of system we lived under. And when Nelson Mandela was released, you know, ruling classes don't give up easy. Their security forces murdered at least 10,000 people in the 4 years in which we were negotiating the transfer of power. The struggle was over, and yet they murdered people at will. It was touch and go whether when we did become the government in the first free elections in 1994 that we could hold on to power. There were many threats of counter-revolution, many threats. And a lot of hard political work was being done to stop that happening. Today, now that Nelson Mandela has passed on, people say Nelson Mandela is like a saint who single-handedly brought peace and reconciliation. What about all the hundreds of thousands of people who took part? He was a leader among leaders, said so himself, was in prison, and Oliver Tambo, in exile, led us to freedom. And yet, you see, our media need individual heroes. Can I give you a silly example? Thousands of people die every day in imperialist wars to control Africa, Syria, Afghanistan, and various parts of the world. And we hardly hear about it when Michael Schumacher bangs his head because he has to get an adrenaline. So, comrades, I want to say that despite the negatives you hear about my country, and I can go on for a long time about them, I can tell you that what we've achieved in only 20 years, I think is quite miraculous. We have problems. We have corruption. We have a health system that's overburdened. We have an education system that's almost collapsing. We have a problem of administration and management in frontline government departments. But millions of people are getting medical care who never got it before. Millions of children go to school who never went to school. Half our population was illiterate. We're overcoming it. And when you read of the violence in the streets and the protests and the marches, this is a living, vital democracy. It functions, and I'm optimistic because it functions. Despite what the imperialists do, despite their attempts to stop us developing, we shall develop, together with other people in Brazil and India and China and other countries that were so heavily oppressed. I want to thank you for inviting me. I think the work you do at a time when there is so much triumphalism amongst the mainstream media who speak as though Germany, for example, is the epitome of democracy, and it's always been democratic. Not that Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were killed in the Weimar Republic, which was democratic, was destroyed. And only after World War II was some kind of democracy forced upon you by other Western powers. And now you lecture us about democracy, as does Britain and America with their corruption. I won't talk about German corruption because I know you don't have it. But the work you do through this conference and through Univel and other organizations in combating this triumphalism, in upholding the rights of people all over the world, for me is such a fulfillment to see, because the struggle continues and it will never end as we win our democracy and then defend it. Thank you for listening. Yeah, now my computer's working. I'll give you all the statistics you need.
Vielen, vielen Dank, Dennis. Gibt es Nachfragen? Ich darf noch mal darauf hinweisen, dass wir für die Nachfragen links und rechts Mikrofone haben, aber versuch's mal, wenn du sehr laut bist.
Ja, es läuft gerade das Flugblatt rum mit den Cuban Five. Könnten Sie ganz bisschen erzählen über die Rolle, die Kuba gespielt hat, also bei der Befreiung von Mandela?
Cuba's role in Africa, not just in South Africa, was very important. From the Congo through to Angola, to Mozambique, to Southern Africa, Cuba played an important role at a time when the collapse of the Soviet Union and leaving perhaps the United States and its surrogate powers virtually in control would have meant going back to the dark ages in Africa. But not only did Cuba provide soldiers in Angola, they provided medical doctors, they provided nurses, they provided agronomists, they provided water experts, lots of civilians. We sent lots of people from South Africa to Cuba to train because we knew we would need doctors and health workers and so on. They trained them for us. So when it came to Nelson Mandela, you know, the key at the end that forced South Africa to negotiate was the people of South Africa, led by the African National Congress, was the defeat of the South African Army of Invasion in Angola at a little place called Quito Carnivale, which is just a crossroads. And it wasn't as though it was a battle that took place over 1 or 2 days. It took 3 months. Suddenly it became a build-up of forces of the apartheid armies confronted by the Angolans, supported by the Cubans with Soviet material and in the end radar and aircraft. And you know, panzer vehicles without air supremacy, Lufthoheit, are pretty useless. And in the end, the South African army with its UNITA allies was defeated in battle, forcing South Africa to accept the idea that it could not be the regional power. There was a window of opportunity. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The Americans were exhausted by their wars in Vietnam and all over the world, needed a breathing space, and compelled South Africa to negotiate. So the defeat through the sacrifice of the Cuban people in that battle at Quito Carnivale, after a long period of support right through Central and Southern Africa, was absolutely key. When we said, we will negotiate when you're ready to negotiate, the apartheid state could not continue. And for white South Africans, you have to understand the psychology as well. With their belief in their supremacy, the idea that black and Cubans out of an African background could actually fight and win a war was such a psychological blow that in the end they had to give in. There was not a graveyard for whites that didn't have a young white soldier buried and a hero for defending apartheid. What a shock to the very defenders of apartheid and their families. I don't rejoice in the deaths, believe me. Why does peace and justice require killing? Why do they go on when it's cheaper to work together? To make us all better off. The role of Cuba was the key. It is a crucial question. And I have to say that somehow the ruling class does not give up easily. It's wealthy, we live in a world of bling, of celebrity, that the measure of a person's worth is his financial worth. And among some of my comrades, I have to tell you, they say they were not in the liberation struggle to remain poor. And they take this to an extreme, where sometimes we seem to have forgotten why we made a revolution, which was to end poverty, to achieve social and economic equality. But we are part of a world system. I think we did not have the stomach to throw our country into such utter chaos that everything would have been destroyed and we would start again. We didn't want a ground zero with people being killed en masse. I told you, over 10,000 people were murdered during that time. And as the negotiations went on, the murders were increasing day after day after day, and we had to settle in the interest of the lives of our people. But inherent in the deal was that the big corporations and the big shareholders and the wealthy, essentially white, but international. And international doesn't really care about the color of the skin, they care about the color of the money. And so they co-opt people to exercise social control, and they accept the cooptation. They get bought. We're not different from other people anywhere in the world. And I want to ask you, if you can give us a recipe of how to deal with capitalism, you have more chance than we've had. Can you tell us how to deal with it? The profits still flow from South Africa to international banks. That hasn't changed. Marikana and the murder of the mine workers, an absolute tragedy that's unbelievable that it should happen. I'm puzzled that some of my comrades in the leadership of the Communist Party and the leadership of the ANC and the leadership of the trade unions, because they've all been mixed up for 40, 50 years. They're interchangeable. Could somehow leave apartheid labor relations in place. Low-paid masses of workers, very highly paid managers, now not only white. Now not only white. That founders of the militant trade unions that were the backbone of our united democratic front have become chairman of the big corporations. That the founder of the mine workers union should be a major shareholder in the Marikana mine. And never ask the question, what's happening to the working people? He's given up his interest. That's the nature of the system we live in. I condemn it in every opportunity I get. I still get invited to speak, even though I attack my leadership in public. I have to tell you that somehow the world thought that Nelson Mandela would wave a magic wand and all problems would be solved. I want to tell you, he was a great Marxist theoretician, really and truly. He took me aside during our trial and he said, when you teach our people Marxism, do not talk about feudalism, slavery, feudalism, as in Europe. Our people don't understand that. You have to speak about class formation in South Africa in the conditions of a transformation from tribalism to modern industrial capitalism and the way these two things fit together. And when I asked him why he was telling me this, he said he just wanted me to know his opinion. And clearly he thought he was going to be hanged and I would pass on the message. I did, of course. He wasn't hanged, and when he was announcing the ANC's program for the first elections and the first government of liberation, he said, made his speech, and then he turned to the trade unions who were there. It was at a trade union conference. To say that there were many workers who thought the ANC leadership would betray the working class. And he said, but we can't. You are the ANC. And if we try to do things that are wrong, elect a new leadership. And then he turned to those who are members of the Communist Party and said, you're also saying this. The same people thought. And he said, but we can't. We've shed too much blood together. That's his generation of leaders. But for the future, if you want to be critical, you have to be organized. You have to have clear policies, clearly thought out, and you have to be able to convince people of the rightness of your view. In other words, politics is not just about friendship and blood. Politics is about organized class forces. And the class forces against us. And the class forces against us are very strong. We battle on and we struggle for our democracy, and we need your support. Thank you very much for listening.
Dennis Goldberg. Thank you very much.
All these very short phrases, which you might think sounds a little bit Hollywood-like, is not a coincidence, because the Department of Defense, as well as the Danish Ministry of Defense, have people working there that are in the US used to work for Hollywood as writing scripts. And we in Denmark has people who has been working also in Hollywood in order not to, which PSYOPs was usually meant to be a way of making propaganda on the battlefield, but PSYOPs has much more turned towards making the justified war seem justifiable to our own populations. The biggest critics of American war in the world during the 80s and the 90s were Germany. And one way of effectively shutting up German criticism towards the aggression in Iraq was the fact that most of the terrorists apparently came from Hamburg. So how can the biggest criticizer in Europe talk against a war which originated from their own country? They can't. It's psychological warfare. In Denmark, we have had a backlash because we really haven't won any wars since we conquered Britain during the Viking Age. We lost the war of 1864 to the Prussians, and the Second World War we lost also. So since then there's been this kind of, we were saved by the Americans, and being saved by someone means that you kind of owe them something. And during the Cold War, Denmark actually had a very, very fine line of foreign policy that meant walking a thin red line between East and West. We were actually the one country in the Western Europe who actively insisted on continuing to cooperate with East Germany. But when the war on terror went on, the Danish Prime Minister, which is now the head of NATO, were very quick to jump on the wagon, and doing so also saw an opportunity for creating an alliance with the US. Not only for saying thank you for saving us in World War I and World War II, but also thank you for in the future helping me to get an international posting for myself. As a trained PSYOPs officer, I was launched into a brand new theater of war. The Danish army hasn't had any big tradition for psychological warfare. So it was brand new when I started, and we had two main area of focus. We had the one which were how to influence the battlefield and the civilian population and the enemy, and we have a much, I should have said smaller one, but actually it's much bigger. How do we influence our own press and media? And it is so that these things are done on a daily basis. It's not just the big occasion, starting a war, ending a war. It's on a day-to-day daily basis with just a few words can do the main difference. For instance, if we in the Danish army have a badly executed fight in Afghanistan where civilians were killed, where Danish and perhaps British troops were killed, as well as insurgents, we don't call it a bad day on the battlefield. No, we call it fog of war, or blue on blue. And most people can figure out what blue on blue means. It doesn't really sound that terrible. If we were instead to call it what it was, a bombing of a civilian house with civilian casualties, where Danish and British soldiers started firing on each other, killing each other, because they mistakenly thought that the fire was coming from the other party. It sounds a bit more grim. So these words are carefully chosen on a daily basis. And in Denmark, we really haven't had that big tradition of militarism, because we kind of lost all these wars. So we had to make up something new. And what we did is that normally you celebrate a one war with a victory parade, ticker tape parade in New York. But we kind of didn't really win any of these wars yet. So what we do is we have a victory parade for every team that comes back from Iraq or from Afghanistan every 6 months in various big Danish cities. And for every team that comes back, we are losing this war more and more. So the parades are getting more and more important for the Danish army. And we have the military police following these parades. So if there are any critics on the road, they are very quickly encircled and made to shut up. The Americans has this tradition about waving a yellow flag in front of the houses to show support for the troops. In Denmark, somebody made this yellow ribbon with a magnetic stick that you could put on the cars. And very soon it was so that if you didn't have that on your car, you must be a traitor. Because Bush said that you are either with us or you are against us. So it was very obvious in Denmark to see who were pro and who were against. And to simplify the world in black and white, pro and con, and them and us, is what we do. Because if we do it and we are successful with it, we can tell who the enemy is. Nobody else can, but we can. Why do we use all this power, all this force to make all these psyops? Is it because it's a righteous war? Is it a good war? Or might it just be because we in the army ourselves are not quite convinced about the righteousness of our mission in these wars? We've been in war for 10 years. And I can't still figure out if I have been losing 2 wars or just losing the same war twice. Thank you.
Rea Wedenburg arbeitet bei der dänischen linken Tageszeitung Arbeiterin und ausgerechnet diese kleine Zeitung in Dänemark, wie die Junge Welt eine kleine, wichtige Zeitung in Deutschland ist, ausgerechnet diese Zeitung hat die Geschichte von Anders Kaergaard publik gemacht. Warum? Das ist ja eigentlich eine Enthüllungsgeschichte, nach der sich alle Medien reisen müssten. Warum ist es bei Arbeiterinnen gelandet und welche Konsequenzen hatte es für die Zeitung, für Dänemark?
Well, that's a very good question. I've asked myself that quite sometimes too. I think to understand this, you need to see the context of media and the war overall. So I'll take some time to do that, a little bit of time. As Germans, I'm sure that many of you can remember when almost 1 million people marched in the streets of Bonn in protest against the nuclear armament in Europe. in the late 1970s, and in the 80s the peace movement was enormous, and there was a huge and critical opposition in the population against war and the imperialist policies of NATO throughout all Europe. This situation was also reflected in the media, where critical reporters, driven by the strong popular movement, asked critical questions about the armament and the war participation. Today, this balance of power has been fundamentally changed in the favor of the ruling class. The peace movement has shrunk into almost nothing, and this has affected the media landscape as well. Today, the media landscape is much more biased, shallow, reactionary. It is hampered by self-censorship, and it fails to raise the necessary critical questions about the imperialist agenda, let alone reflecting the popular opposition against the war, which just today, after all, is there. The press that used to speak out against war and missiles and raise the critical questions, they are now discussing under which conditions we should be military present in countries such as Mali or Syria or Iraq. And no one shows that there is an alternative to war and exploitation. This, of course, is closely linked with the weakness of the peace movement. So the question is, what do we do then? How can we, under those circumstances, work to strengthen the critical anti-imperialist movement? There's nothing, of course, we would rather do than report of million marches against the war, but when the peace movement is no stronger than it is, then how can we, under those conditions, help to mobilize the resistance against war and imperialism? There we must try as progressive media to find other ways to unmask the war and the armament in order to raise public awareness about the necessity of this resistance. We must find ways to drive the anti-imperialist journalism forward. This is our ambition, but things does not always happen the way you imagined they would. And one day, in April last year, the doorbell rang in Arbejderens editorial offices in Copenhagen. It was a captain in the Danish army who said, "Hello, my name is Anders. I'm a former high-ranking intelligence officer in the Danish Defense Intelligence Service. I have this stack of classified reports and documents. I need a whiteboard, 2 different colors whiteboard markers, and a huge table for all my documents. And I want to give you everything." Oh wow, that was not what we expected on that regular Wednesday morning. And of course, when something is almost too good to be true, you get a little suspicious. So we asked ourselves the same question. Now, Arbejderen, as Rüdiger said, is the smallest Danish nationwide newspaper and the only one which is openly left-wing. So we asked ourselves, why did he come to us? Of course, Anders can also answer for himself, but as I understand it, he chose us because he felt that we would tell the whole story, not just jumping from scandal to scandal and focus on the headlines that sells a newspaper. The documents that Anders brought that day were about the so-called Operation Green Desert that you all heard Anders talk about earlier, the biggest Danish-led operation in Iraq, where Anders were as one of the top-ranking intelligence officers. His documentation showed how Danish soldiers on this operation watched passively while Iraqi soldiers dragged 36 innocent civilians out of their houses in the morning, kicked and beat and imprisoned them. And some of the documentation later revealed showed that the Danish army commanders already knew before the operation that the Iraqi information that led to the operation was classified with the lowest possible credibility, and that Anders, as he said earlier, as a responsible intelligence officer, warned again and again that the soldiers would only meet unarmed civilians, peasants, women and children on the target. Despite the warnings, the Danish commander-in-chief chose to conduct the operation because half a year earlier there had been a series of scandals about the Danish maltreatment of Iraqi prisoners, and the Danish support for the war participation was weakening. So the Danish battalion needed a successful operation to show the necessity of the Danish forces' presence in Iraq back at home. The operation went completely wrong. There were only civilians at the targets. 36 innocent Iraqis were beaten and sent away to 2 months of imprisonment and severe torture before they were released one by one without being either charged or put before a judge. A clear violation of international law. Despite the failure of the operation, the Danish battalion issued a press release the day after the operation to the Danish public. Here they made no mention of the unjustified operation or the likelihood that civilians had been captured. Instead, it stated that the operation was successful and showed the importance of the Danish presence in Iraq. And why is this so interesting? Well, this is because it shows exactly how the army has a conscious strategy to deceive the public opinion. It shows how the war is, all in all, one big lie for the press and the public. This is what makes the story so interesting. From Anders, who worked, as you know, in Iraq as a PSYOPs officer, as officer of psychological warfare, or what others might call propaganda, we have learned that a lot about the strategy to make war look like a success. Like Anders said, we've had a huge development in PSYOPs on the home front, military parades, yellow ribbons, national memorial days for the serving soldiers, and so on. We've also learned how closely most of the reporters who write about war are linked with the military, what you call embedded journalism. Even newspapers who claim to be critical and independent have reporters who give classes about press handling in the army. Reporters are invited to embedded tours in the war zones, if they accept the conditions, of course, and you quickly learn that it's easier to get interviews and join the missions when you stay on good terms with the head of the army. And in this context, I think you can find the reasons why Anders came to us. So you asked also about how did the press and the public react to our story. And well, first of all, the story showed us that there really is a need for critical media like Junge Welt and also like Arbejderen. And secondly, that there are very powerful forces working against us. We saw that when we called the Danish Defense Command 24 hours before the first story was published to ask for their reply. And we didn't dare to call before because the Danish army has previously gone to great length to shut down critical stories. But as soon as we told them what we had gotten hold of, the phone was hung up, and for the next 15 minutes it was impossible to get through to any of the army's central phone lines, no matter what phone we called from. So we were a little bit nervous in the editorial offices in those 15 minutes. Of course, we had copies of all the documents in a secure location, but still you think about what to remove from your desk and your computer. They never showed up, however, and initially we managed to break through with the story. Almost all the Danish media talked about it, and a number of questions was raised in the parliament. But the day after, the next day, the army issued a press statement accusing us of not having documentation of the story. This was a complete lie. We have made a documentation site online where we have made all the relevant documents available for free download, so everybody can go and check that our story holds completely true. Despite of that, a long line of media echoed the army's accusations completely uncritical without fact-checking, so this also tells us something about the forces we are up against. The disclosures did get a lot of consequences, however. 32 of the 36 Iraqi civilians who were imprisoned on the operation have since initiated legal proceedings against Denmark for complicity in the torture they were submitted to in prison. And one of the confidential reports that we leaked is an important document in their trial because it shows that the army knew they were civilians before the operation. Less than 24 hours after our first story was published, the army was forced to reveal the intelligence report, which it had otherwise kept secret for 18 months. This means it can be used in the trial. The story led to a series of debates and questions in the parliament, and the Danish Minister of Defense admitted that it was never examined whether the prisoners were civilians or top terrorists, and that the consideration for the cooperation with the Iraqi military was put above the consideration for the Iraqi civilians. The Danish population was shown in prime time once again that the only thing that comes out of joining the US-led imperialist wars are lies and violation of international laws. Perhaps this was reflected in when a majority of Danes in a recent study turned out to be against the war in Syria. The story has also helped to raise a debate about the rights of whistleblowers. In November we at Arbejderen held a conference in the parliament together with Anders, and the organizations Amnesty and Transparency International, where representatives of the government participated and promised to ensure in the law that whistleblowers like Anders in the future can talk about wrongdoings also in the system of defense without fear of reprisals. Now we have to see if they comply with it, but it's definitely helped to highlight the problem and show that there's a newspaper that takes the whistleblowers seriously. This, we hope, can also mean that more brave people like Anders dare to step forward with the truth. But it's far from a happy ending. As Anders said earlier, despite of all the lies and violations documented and confirmed by witnesses, the situation is still that none of the Iraqi prisoners have been allowed to try their cases before a Danish court. None of the responsible behind the lies and the abuses have been put on trial, neither generals nor ministers. The only one who has been punished is Anders, who was put on trial, at first threatened with half a year in prison, and then ended up getting a fine of around 2,000 euros. So we are fighting against very powerful forces, but our example, I think, also shows that even a small media can challenge this power, especially when you are lucky enough to get a little help from inside the system.
Thank you very much, Comrade Klaus. Thank you very much. Let me first say that it is a unique feeling being with this wonderful audience, and my honor is all the greater that we are gathered here under the name of historic figure Rosa Luxemburg, symbolizing the struggle for justice, for freedom, for independent thought, and for progress in the world. It is a rare occasion, a rare privilege for me that I can address such a huge audience. So let me say that we are grateful to all of you, to hundreds of thousands of Serbian friends all over Germany and Europe, for your solidarity, your support, and humanitarian assistance rendered to suffering people in Yugoslavia during civil wars and destruction of that country, and especially during the criminal NATO aggression in 1999. So, comrades, friends, brothers, thank you very much. I would like to... These are nothing to do with my personal thanks. This is the feeling of many citizens of former Yugoslavia, feeling of duty to all of you, and this is the feeling of all independent-minded citizens of Serbia and other former Yugoslav republics. Now, let me say that my duty originally was to speak about the chain of the wars which started with NATO aggression against Yugoslavia, against then Serbia and Montenegro in 1999, and ensuing wars after that on the same pattern. Of course, I would like to be very informative and I would like to meet your interest, but I am afraid I may be in a way partial and subjective because I can witness well about the causes and consequences of NATO aggression in 1999 and the time doesn't permit to dwell at extent about ensuing wars. Well, you have been hearing and reading all these 15 years that NATO aggression on Yugoslavia was introduced as a pattern for future NATO wars against all those who do not follow the suit and order of Imperia, the order of those militarily the strongest. This war on Yugoslavia was conducted against all basic principles of international law and international relations. Actually, I would say against basic principles of civilization. There was no only breach of NATO founding act from 1949, but there was violation of UN Charter, violation of constitutions of most of NATO member countries who entered the war against independent states which didn't threat any other state without asking for permission of parliaments or from other democratic institutions. So we see abuse of democracy in those who pretend to serve as example to the rest of the world. None of the parliaments permitted participation in aggression against one independent European country. So let me draw your attention to some elements, some other elements. How did it came about it? First was orchestrated propaganda to demonize Serbia, to demonize the leadership and nation of my country by those so-called independent Western media, like CNN and the others. Then there was a staging of negotiations apparently aimed at avoiding the war. These are known to be Rambouillet negotiations. In Rambouillet there were no negotiations whatsoever. The delegations which met there never sat together to negotiate. Actually, it was only a staged performance to convince European and American publics that there was no other solution than to initiate war. Then there was a staged massacre of civilians in Russia. This was a real trigger to convince also the public that the war, that attack was unavoidable. And so 78 days of constant destruction of the country, apparently to protect human rights of oppressed Albanian national minority. And that was called humanitarian intervention. It was actually the war of conquest and not the war to serve humanitarian objectives. More than 4,000 people were killed, about 8,000 people seriously wounded, hundreds of thousands left homeless and jobless because factories and civilian projects were destroyed. Such objects as hospitals, schools, even historic monuments were destroyed. About 30 radio and TV stations and TV transmitters were targeted by NATO aviation and destroyed in the name of what? And thousands of apartments of other civilian objects were destroyed also. The damage was estimated at $120 billion. And after aggression, what happened? There were so-called democratic free elections. Actually, the puppet regime was installed over there to serve not the interests of citizens, but to serve the interests of masters from abroad, from those from Washington, Brussels, and other power centers. And this has been repeated at all ensuing free and fair elections. So we have aggression which was conducted outside of NATO territory without UN Security Council approval, in alliance with a terrorist alliance, terrorist KLA organization. This was violation of all standards and all principles. This was used as precedent for wars in Afghanistan in November 2001, Iraq, March 2003, Libya, Syria, Mali, and some other countries, as we heard today, Sudan, and even civil conflicts in Egypt were orchestrated also from abroad. What are common characteristics? Media role in demonizing a victim, then accusation for human rights violations, destabilizing role of opposition and internal extremists, stage attacks on civilians, rajak or use of sarin gas in Syria, or extensive use of force against civilians in Libya, and so on. Then it was invoking of so-called a right to protect, and finally launching military operation. This is a pattern. In stage 2, we have, in most of the cases, free and fair democratic elections, installing of puppet regimes, transfer of national wealth to multinational corporations. Here, let me note that some most profitable businesses in Kosovo and Metohija are owned by Madeleine Albright and the other who were leaders of humanitarian intervention. So you really can see in reality what were the motives. Continuity of puppet regimes is already referred to. What these interventions are leaving behind: chaos, misery, ethnic or religious conflicts, thousands and millions of refugees, over 1 million of refugees from Iraq, from Syria now, displaced persons, unemployment, fragmentation of states. Libya doesn't function any longer as a state. Iraq, who would believe that Kirkuk would follow orders from Damascus, or what we can see about Fallujah now being controlled by some other forces than the government. Governments installed from abroad to serve foreign interests cannot be favored or supported by own people. What we say here have also is a redrawing of borders. We have proliferation of small puppet states who are easy to be manipulated. Divide and rule has its renaissance in 21st century. Occupied Kosovo is even today, although it had unilaterally and illegally proclaimed its independence in 2008, it serves to enable oil and gas pipeline routes being controlled, to control Caspian Basin, Russia and Russian borders, Middle East, even to control Western Europe, to control also multi-billion-dollar heroin trade. As everybody knows, Afghanistan, after the occupation in 2001 until 2011, developed production of heroin 40-fold, 40 times. Is it just coincidence? Is it just spontaneous? Or someone had interest for expanding heroin production and support to operations elsewhere, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria now, and other places. This aggression on Yugoslavia in 1999 marked militarization of Europe, first of the Balkan, but then of Europe. The camp base Bonstil was established in 1999 to immediately be followed by 4 new bases of USA in Bulgaria, another 4 new USA bases in Romania, some new bases, anti-ballistic rocket bases in Poland, and so on and so forth. So we should be alerted. In Europe today, there are more foreign military bases than at the peak of the Cold War. And the question is, what for? Is democracy in danger? Are there different ideological systems? Are opposing military blocs? None of that. Yet, Europe is militarized today much more than any time in its history. NATO expansion toward east has initiated arms race. The theory of preventive nuclear wars, the theory and doctrine of using of minimal nuclear bombs actually brings a danger of global conflict. KLA was the allied force of NATO during NATO aggression on Yugoslavia. Now we have, you see, many new editions of KLA in Syria. We had such forces also in Libya and elsewhere. We are faced with double standards. Who are terrorists? There are terrorists who are in alliance with NATO. In 1999, terrorist KLA was NATO ground force. Drug trafficking, you can see that 60% of heroin trade in Europe is controlled by, let's say, Balkan Albanian mafia. It is actually aimed at earning profit, but by the way, destroying European youth, financing lobbies, financing extremists and terrorists. Human organ trafficking was in Kosovo. Evidence presented to the Hague Tribunal, according to Hague prosecutor Carla De Ponte, was destroyed. The French author Pierre Péan wrote recently a book, probably known to you, called Just War for Mafia State. CE, Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, on initiative of Swiss parliamentarian Dick Marty, adopted a resolution that trafficking and harvesting human organs be established. Nothing ever since has happened. It is controlled under the principles that someone's friend never can be wrong. Global objectives of all these wars in chain, abolishing sovereignty, establishing global control of humanity. What we have, your public, yourself, well known, this spying of millions of citizens in Western civilization, spying of electronic communication like internet and so on. Establishing one unique global world system, profit-centered, without any social, health, education, and other securities financed from public money. For that, austerity measures do not permit, but austerity measures in no NATO country affect the military budgets. In spite of the world crisis, all military budgets are growing. What for? Who is endangering peace? Establishing actually global imperialism. Now we are faced, my dear comrades, with a crucial question. Global peace, or shall we permit global war? This chain of wars, which started in 1999 and followed by many other aggressions, actually has global characteristics. I have already formally wrote that the Third World War has started. Why World War? Because it is conducted by world powers. Why World War? Because it is conducted not on a single country but on several continents. Why World War? Because it has no regional or local objectives. It has global objective, as I mentioned, global imperial system. Global imperialism is their objective. And maybe it is overstatement, but we have to be alerted. The imperial powers have exhausted resources for maintaining their privileged positions. Now they are trying to redistribute the wealth on the earth. We know what happened with a redistribution of colonies, what happened with expansion toward east, and so on. So we hope humanity will accept a reasonable position and not permitting global war. Yet the country's victims are not accepting to be colonies any longer. They are growing even faster than imperial powers, and the gap between is even in military power is being less. So if we say that NATO aggression against Yugoslavia in 1999 was a turning point toward globalization of interventionism and toward globalization of imperialism, then we can say that events over Syria, Iran, and Ukraine recently represent a turning point toward multipolar world order. We, activists of peace and solidarity, are getting better chance for our objectives. Multipolarization does not necessarily bring democratization, be it internal, be it international, but it brings a space to upgrade, uplift our struggle for peace. I'm convinced that we ourselves, independent-minded Europeans and citizens of the earth, that we understand this chance and that we will exploit it for peace and solidarity. Thank you very much.
Wie bei diesen Konferenzen üblich ist der Zeitplan ja immer im Verzug. Trotzdem wollen wir den Versuch machen, noch eine Fragerunde anzuschließen. Ihr wisst, dass links und rechts außen Mikrofone stehen und an denen sollen sich die Fragesteller bitte aufstellen. Einer steht schon längere Zeit an dem Mikrofon. Bitte die Frage.
First of all, I would like to, I'm a freelance journalist from Denmark, my name is Tue Magnussen. I would like to thank Sivadin Jovanovic for making this presentation, but definitely there are some very parts of it that I don't agree in. I think you had a very xenophobic attitude towards Islam and also against the Albanian nation. And I must say that despite I had a strong feeling for the former Yugoslavia of Tito, I have never understood why the Albanians, as one of the people of former Yugoslavia, the Albanians in Kosovo shouldn't be allowed to have their national independence. And I'm very much agreeing with you to make a protest against US imperialism in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan and everywhere. But I think that the problem in Kosovo is that the lack of solidarity from Serbian and Croatian comrades more or less forced our Albanian friends of the Kosovo Liberation Army, which is called one of the first and very strongest growing national liberation movement in the post-war period of Europe. They were more or less pushed by the lack of solidarity from the rest of Yugoslavia in the hands to be supported by NATO. And the only way I think we can make a free, independent world is that we still base it on the right of each nationality to have its independence. Thank you very much for making your statement. I'll be very glad if you could make some comments, and then afterwards I hope that we can join in a common fight against imperialism for world peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Of course, independent Kosovo doesn't have, to my opinion, to do very much with self-determination, but it has to do with imperialism in need to fragment countries to fragment and weaken the countries who oppose imperialism. I will quote some documents of American Congress which state apparently that we should never permit Serbian nation to be political factor on the Balkan. This was the aim. And I would also like to say that separatism in Serbia was to fragment Serbia and not to do good for our Albanian citizens, for our Albanian brothers. I would like to quote a German diplomat who was a head of EEC mission in Kosovo and Metohija. In his letter to present German Chancellor, trying to convince the Chancellor not to admit, not to recognize independent Kosovo, he said, in the eve of NATO aggression, I was in Kosovo and Metohija. There were no reports whatsoever, be it from his side or from any other independent side, of massive violation of human rights in Kosovo. There were no signs or reports of organized crimes against Albanian national minority. And therefore he concluded there were no reasons for NATO aggression on Yugoslavia. This is a written document. There is need also to remind you, comrades, that Serbia, although reduced, still is perhaps the most different in national composition of population. The country where more than 1/3 of total populations are national minority citizens, be also Muslims, Albanians in 3 districts on the south, and Hungarians, Croats, and so on. Serbia is a small country, is projected and is demonized, and I invite you all to come and see the life in Serbia. You won't see any discrimination, you won't see any phobia in Serbia. You will see a tendency for taking more care about interests of Serbia than Serbia is allowed. Finally, I admit I am not objective. I am subjective in defending right positions.
I think we have to address a number of very important issues which have already emerged in the course of these sessions. I am very impressed at the level of debate and discussion, something which in a North American or even an Anglo-Saxon environment would not normally take place. It reflects a level of understanding of fundamental questions. I would first like to address the issue of global warfare. Global warfare has been a project of the US military from World War I. Even though the United States was not actively involved in World War I, there was a strategy to encourage allies and enemies to fight with a view to weakening allies as well as enemies. It's a very important concept in US military doctrine. We see it today with NATO. The United States will let every other country intervene militarily in Syria before it actually intervenes. Overtly, of course, covertly they intervene through intelligence operations. So that the concept of the long war, lange Krieg, the long war, this is a term of the US, of the Pentagon, it's not my concept. This concept has existed, and certainly has existed since the end of World War II. And there is a continuum. There's also a continuum in relation to the war crimes committed. If we think of the war crimes committed in the last part of World War II against Japan, against Germany, subsequently during the Korean War, where 30% of the population of North Korea was simply wiped out through extensive carpet bombing, subsequently in the wars in Vietnam and Cambodia. Similarly, the strategy was always to target civilians. The concept was presented by General Tommy Franks in an article written. General Tommy Franks led the invasion into Iraq in 2003. He was the Central Command General. Now he talks about what is described, and it's a military concept, massive casualty producing event. Massive casualty producing event is that you kill lots of civilians, and invariably you blame the victims for the crimes you have committed. And this is a continuum of US military interventionism. In Indonesia, some million communist partisans and their families were liquidated on orders of the CIA. In declassified documents, they acknowledged these killings, and they also acknowledged their role in these killings. They didn't quite acknowledge the numbers, but they blamed the deaths on the victims. And now we see this occurring in Syria, and we're talking about something far more diabolical, where Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorist organizations, controlled, financed by the CIA, perhaps through Saudi intelligence or through Qatar, trained, equipped. There's a whole history, I can't get into details, but these Al-Qaeda affiliated operatives are the foot soldiers of the Western Military Alliance. And what do? They go in and kill thousands of people, and then the deaths are blamed on the government of Bashar al-Assad. That was right from the beginning. I happened to be in Syria 2 weeks before the war started in Dara on the 15th of March. When I was in Damascus, the US ambassador Robert Stephen Ford had been appointed, and I understood that something was in the making. Robert Stephen Ford is architect of these death squads, or one of the architects. He worked closely with John Negroponte out of the embassy in Iraq, and was responsible for the setting up of the Iraqi death squadrons. So that when you now look at the Syrian death squadrons, Al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Levant, these are constructs of Western intelligence, and they cannot be seen otherwise. And we have now ample evidence. The same thing goes for the Libya Islamic Fighting Group in Libya. Now, I say this because, at least in the Anglo-Saxon countries, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, maybe even France for that matter, I won't discuss Germany, but the consensus is among anti-war activists, we are against the war, but we are supportive of the campaign against international terrorism, what is now coined as the global war on terrorism. And this has meant, it's very important, that right from the beginning in 2001, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the anti-war movement, with some exceptions, has towed the line. There was a significant anti-war movement prior to the invasion of Iraq, but the move today is supportive of responsibility to protect, and more than that, many so-called leftists, self-proclaimed leftists and progressives are in fact endorsing this military agenda, including Democracy Now! In the United States. I have to mention it, okay? There are some very prominent intellectuals, I won't mention their names, but they're prominent leftists. They also support these wars, or they play lip service, or they say, we're against US foreign policy, but we think Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. Okay? All those concepts you will find, so that in effect, we have to address the disinformation which emanates from these so-called self-proclaimed progressives, which cover the landscape. They're in NGOs, they're in peace collectives, and so on and so forth. And it is another level in the propaganda process. It is what I would describe as manufacturing dissent rather than consent. You manufacture dissent, you say, I hate the government, Obama is a dictator, but you still support NATO's humanitarian mandate. And I mean, I don't want to get into details, but Amy Goodman's report on Democracy Now! Was celebrating the revival, the renewal in Libya once these criminals had taken office and NATO had finally surfaced and occupied the country using Al-Qaeda affiliated operatives, all trained in CIA camps in Afghanistan. So let us understand that the global war on terrorism is a fabrication. It is not a global war on terrorism. It is terrorism, state terrorism, using terrorists as foot soldiers to kill civilians. Now let me also say, there's no divide among us. I mean, there's no conceptual divide, at least within this audience, between being anti-war and waging a campaign against neoliberalism. The tendency has been in many movements is that say, we're against the IMF, the World Bank, but we support NATO. Or they will say, we want climate justice, another kind of phony kind of objective, without, of course, acknowledging that at this moment, concurrent with the most serious economic crisis in world history, plus a global military agenda which threatens the future of humanity with nuclear weapons, we have the Fukushima crisis, unheralded, undocumented in the mainstream media, but well understood that this is the most serious industrial crisis in world history, leading to the contamination of the Pacific Ocean, as well as the whole western coastline of North America, and of course the food chain in Japan, completely. But more than that, again, it is part of the general process of media disinformation and propaganda and cover-up. We have a recent report saying 98% of the what do you call it, the bottom of the ocean is covered with dead animal life, sea life. In other words, a complete destruction of animal life in the Pacific Ocean off the California coastline. Again, this type of information is not normally understood or made known, and it's important that that message get out. But we're not dealing with separate issues. Neoliberalism is the ultimate objective of warfare. It's the derogation of sovereignty of national governments, it's the restructuring of their financial system, it's the imposition of IMF guidelines. We saw it in Yugoslavia. And the objective is not necessarily to win a war. The objective is to destroy countries and transform those countries into territories. And we can see that Vietnam won the war militarily, but in effect, what is Vietnam now? It's a periphery of the global cheap labor economy. It is now entered into an alliance with the United States and NATO. What is Cambodia? It's a proxy state. The national currency is the US dollar. And if we are to learn something from the economics of Rosa Luxemburg, particularly with regard to what Marx called Department 2B, luxury consumption, we see that the two sectors, the two dynamic sectors of the global economy, what are they? Military spending and luxury economy, the whole gamut of entertainment, hotels, casinos, luxury vehicles and so on. That is tremendous expansion. And it is also the source, of course, of co-optation and corruption of these puppet states. So that the objective is not to win wars, the objective is to transform countries such as Vietnam, Cambodia, Libya, with 3.5% of global oil and gas reserves, and the largest reserves in Africa, almost twice those of the United States of America. Of course, it's a territory now, it's no longer a country. And that is the nature of global warfare. There is a roadmap, there's a sequencing of military operations. There is also a statement, and if you consult US military doctrines, you'll see there's a statement to the effect that, and I quote, Project for the New American Century, PNAC, that our objective is to wage multiple, simultaneous theater wars in different parts of the world and to win those wars. Now, I should mention that the nature of warfare has changed dramatically. We're no longer in an era of conventional warfare where you go in, and that I think changed in 2003. It's the more recent military operations are somewhat of a different nature. One does not exclude the other, but non-conventional warfare has been used. Cyber warfare, the destabilization of the country's infrastructure, the electricity, communications. Of course, the use of special forces in covert operations, the use of these criminal death squads, and I should mention that the criminal death squads in Syria, all of them are under the supervision of Western special forces, okay? British SAS, French parachutistes, and so on. Often they're former because they're hired by mercenary companies, and they also train them in the use of chemical weapons. There's ample evidence to that effect, and consequently, those chemical weapons of attacks of August 21st were perpetrated by the Western military alliance, not by the terrorists, okay? I mean, in national international law, paid killers are responsible, but the ultimate architects of those killings of civilians in Syria was NATO and the United States and their allies. But I would say the orders emanated directly from Washington. That's very... And the matter of the fact is that we can prove it, okay? We can prove it. We have all the elements to show that, that the United States government is supporting al-Nusra. We even have John McCain, Senator John McCain goes into Syria, crosses the border illegally into Syria without a visa, and then gets photo ops with some of these Al-Qaeda leaders, buddy. And that then is presented, John Cain with the freedom fighters, but in fact they're not freedom fighters, they're death squads. They're recruited from Saudi Arabia prisons, okay? They're people serving who have criminal records very often. There's a massive process of recruitment, and I can tell you, and this is confirmed by press reports, Israeli press reports, which are not particularly pro-Syrian, but they're certainly pro-NATO. They say, that was a press report already in 2011, we are that NATO and the Turkish High Command are recruiting mujahideen in different parts of the Muslim world, and that these would be the foot soldiers of the Western military alliance in these countries, including Libya and Syria. And when they finish in Libya, they move them to Syria. So that is the kind of war that we are waging. And it emanates, of course, from September 11, 2001, when the United States government barely declared at 9 in the evening, they declared war on Afghanistan with absolutely no evidence to the fact that Afghanistan had attacked America. Okay? Now that sounds absurd because I didn't see any Afghanistani airplanes surrounding in New York City. But the Atlantic Council, the following morning in Brussels, they convened and they said, they invoked Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, that's the founding document, under the doctrine of collective security. They said, the United States, a member state of the Atlantic Alliance, has been attacked from abroad, okay? But meaning a foreign power, but it was not very well clarified, and consequently we invoked the doctrine of collective security and we are attacking Afghanistan, even though the Afghanistan government on several occasions through diplomatic channels said, if you have evidence to the fact that Osama bin Laden is guilty of these 9/11 attacks, we are prepared to deliver them to the US justice system. And George W. Bush said, we don't negotiate with terrorists, okay? So that was it. But I can also tell you that that's another, maybe digressing, but Osama bin Laden on the 10th of September was admitted to a Pakistani military hospital in Rawalpindi. Now, anybody who has been to Rawalpindi knows that this is a place swarming with US military advisors. He could not have got into the hospital unnoticed, and then on the 11th he was discharged for his kidney problems. In any case, there's a whole issue of the Osama legend. These attacks were not perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda was identified, and the state sponsor of Al-Qaeda was Afghanistan, and we jumped. There was some mysterious report from the State Department which was there to justify the intervention, and there collectively, I'm not saying only the governments, but all the NGOs were applauding, you say, applauding on humanitarian grounds, because this was a massive casualty producing event. And it is there to create what in a previous operation, which was called Operations Northwood, which was a secret plan to attack Cuba using the pretext that Cuban community members in Miami had been killed by Cuban forces, okay? They wanted to use this as a pretext, and they called it, they said it will create a useful wave of indignation. People will feel in solidarity, and that's exactly what happened on the 11th of September. It was the solidarity, which I think everybody has, in a sense, towards one's fellow human beings. 2,000 people had been killed, but we didn't ask ourselves who killed them. But what we were told was, because these people were killed, we now have a pretext and a justification to wage war on Afghanistan, which was the first producer of grade 4 heroin in the world, 93%. The Taliban, in their wisdom, had implemented, with the support of the United Nations, the most effective anti-drug eradication program in UN history. They were congratulated at the General Assembly. Actually, shortly after September 11, the production had fallen by more than 90% at 150 tons, and now it's something, and then immediately when US troops came in, the whole production flared up to historical levels and beyond, and I think it's something of the order of 6,000 or more tons, and the United Nations has served to camouflage that. Now, let me look at the broader military agenda post 9/11, but bearing in mind that this is part of a much broader framework of conquest by the United States, which is, the United States is not necessarily the most advanced economy, but it has the most advanced military, and it also has the most manipulative financial system. And it is serving the oil companies, the biotech conglomerates, the Wall Street financial conglomerates, and so on. And all of these major actors are behind the war agenda. And I should say that the war has, in a sense, been privatized through the influx of mercenary groups and so on. Nuclear war has been privatized. I won't get into the details, we don't have time. But the nuclear doctrine, which was formulated in the wake of 9/11, was done in consultation with the nuclear weapons industry. And the meeting was held in 2003 on Hiroshima Day, as if that was the day that they were celebrating. Okay? And there's a continuity in nuclear doctrine from the Manhattan Project, Hiroshima, to the present, whereby nuclear weapons are now designated as harmless to the surrounding civilian population. The issue of radiation isn't even mentioned in military documents, and they say now we have mini nukes, but those mini nukes are only from 1/3 to 6 times the Hiroshima bomb, but they're considered humanitarian bombs. They've changed the labels on these bombs. But that, again, is something, it's the privatization of war, which is ongoing. If we look at the Middle East today, we have at present, or we had up until recently, 4 distinct war theaters. Okay, we had the AFPAC, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq. Well, yeah, we had Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Palestine, which is also an area of conflict, and Libya. But now what is happening is that these war theaters are in a sense merging together. And we see that the war, there's a process of escalation. The same death squads which are set loose in Syria are now being set loose in Iraq. It's the same organization as Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Levant. And they were involved in the events in Fallujah. Now, what does that mean? It means essentially that the United States and its allies, mainly the intelligence operatives, are creating internal strife between these, in Iraq, between these Al-Qaeda rebels, which are supported by US intelligence, and government forces, with a view eventually to weakening the government, as well as ultimately dividing Iraq along sectarian lines. And it is not by accident that the same groups involved in Iraq are also now involved in Syria. It's an open border. It's a desert. It's an open border. And what we must understand is that we wanted to have a map, but the technology was, the German technology was deficient. But no, that's a joke. Spaß. Okay. But always some simple technological things are a problem. But when you have to send a nuclear bomb, that's another matter. But what I'm saying, picture the macro region from the eastern Mediterranean to the border of Afghanistan with China. Okay, that's China's western frontier. It's called the Xinjiang-Uyghur Autonomous Region. And it is also an area where there's a Muslim population. And there's also an insurgency there, which is funded by the United States through Pakistani inter-services intelligence. But that border, that area, that macro region extending from the eastern Mediterranean, the Syrian, Lebanese, Egyptian, Israeli, Egyptian coastline all the way to Central Asia, the borders of Afghanistan, Pakistan with China, and then if you go south, it's from the Caspian Sea basin down to the tip of Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Now that is the area of, first of all, that area is strategic. It encompasses something of the order of more than 60% of the world's reserves of oil and natural gas. There may be some discrepancies in the estimates there, but it is an area which has 30 times more oil than all the Western countries combined. I'm sorry, no, 30 times those of the United States, which has 2%, okay? So we're dealing with tremendous oil wealth, and of course the issue of narcotics is a very important question, because it's 93% of the world's supply of heroin comes from Afghanistan. And Afghanistan also has very precious metals and strategic resources. So Saudi, from the tip of the Arabian Peninsula up to Caspian Basin, and there you have an area which is a macro area, which essentially at the moment we see the escalation of this military adventure to the entire region. Of course, the ultimate targets are Iran, Russia, and China. And Russia and China allies are Syria and Iran. And at the same time as this macro region is becoming a regional war zone, we see the Asian pivot, in other words, the threats directed against China directly, but these have been ongoing for quite a number of years, in fact, since the 90s. The whole militarization of the coastline, okay, the Chinese coastline, its northern border is militarized, but the whole the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the western frontier with Afghanistan and Pakistan militarized with US military facilities. And so that is the context. And if this war extends into a theater operation, the use of nuclear weapons against Iran has and is contemplated. I know, consulting military documents, we have ample evidence to that effect, and it's very important it's important that people are informed of these developments, but it is particularly important that people who have embraced this progressive consensus, and which include a lot of people. Some of them do it because they want to toe the line with the leaders. Many of the leaders are co-opted, or they don't have an understanding of the details and the seriousness of this military agenda. I can also tell you that everything is centralized in one location, which is US Strategic Command headquarters in Nebraska. Okay, that is where everything takes place. All the air defense system of NATO, the United States, Israel is a junior partner in this whole process. They can't wage a war without the green light from the United States. Okay, but maybe they will get the green light. Okay, because as I mentioned, they like to make other people do the war for them. That's why they manage that. That's an instrument of conquest. And the same thing with the French. The French are doing the work of the Americans, and in fact they're losing all their sphere of influence in sub-Saharan Africa. So this area which I've just described, plus the area of North Africa, extending it into Central Africa, that is the area now where we see an expanding war theater in 2 or 3 overlapping regions. The operations in Mali, you send in the Al-Qaeda and then you send in the French. You control both sides, again, and ultimately use this as a pretext to destabilize a democratically elected government in Mali, okay, which is an ancient civilization. I mean, in fact, all these countries have thousands of years of history. Now, let me conclude, because I have to, and I'll conclude in a few minutes. There are three elements of propaganda. Rainer Rupp, this afternoon, I think, his presentation reveals how propaganda functions from within organizations. Okay? There's a propaganda within. In other words, within NATO, within the governments, within the parliaments, within the financial establishments, that somehow they believe their own lies. And they have to believe their own lies if they say, well, yes, it's collateral damage, yes, but it's all for a good cause, it's democracy, we're spreading democracy, and they repeat it ad nauseum, they actually believe in it. They are exercise of internal propaganda taking place, okay? Which in the United States they call it the top off, which stands for top officials. Top officials from military, civilian, municipal, business and so on, and they meet together and they simulate attacks on Iran or some other country, and then they say, well, what do we do in the case of a terrorist attack, etc., etc. And then it's the whole notion that of demonizing people of Muslims, for the simple reason that the Muslims are the people who inhabit the countries that own the oil. Okay, that's if those countries were occupied by Buddhists, they would demonize the Buddhists. That's the only reason we demonize Muslims. You add to that Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria, you know, the countries that are not in that macro region, it's almost 70% of crude oil reserves. And consequently, this is one of the objectives is the battle for oil. It's not the only one, it's an entire process of conquest, of destroying institutions, national governments, and impoverishing people beyond bounds, either through warfare or through the subsequent intervention of the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank is even worse than IMF. Okay? Now, so there are three areas of propaganda. One is internal propaganda from within, which we don't know too much about. The second has to do with the tangible media propaganda, which appears persistently in the mainstream media, and when you read the Frankfurter Allgemein or Spiegel or the New York Times, you get that, even though there's some element of information there, but it conveys a consensus, the global war on terrorism, responsibility to protect, and it invades people's minds, and ultimately they may not believe in it, but if they don't believe it, they might lose their jobs, or they might lose their friends, or their wife, or their, you know, that is how it works. It's consensus, it's building a consensus. And the important thing for us is to break that consensus, because it's a very fragile consensus. Now, but let me say that the most insidious, and I'll complete the discussion on that, the most insidious element of propaganda is that which takes place within these so-called progressive organizations. How does it work? I'll mention it in a nutshell. Many of these organizations are funded directly by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the McCarthy Foundation, all elite foundations, not to mention the Open Society Institute, and very often they don't know about it. I can say that most of these, the Occupy movement is funded by foundations, Anonymous is funded by foundations, and then you have Otpor, of course, it's a Serbian organization, which now is involved in the revolution business, Canvas. And what do? They go into countries and they advise the protest movement. Now, I can say, and we have to be very careful, but if you look at the situation in Egypt, I'm not questioning the protest movement. It has very strong popular foundations. I'm questioning the insidious role of selected organizations and leaders. MI6 has been infiltrated by MI6 for more than 30 years. The April 6th movement was in liaison, the student movement was in liaison with the US Embassy, and Kifaya, which in Arabic means enough, is funded directly by US foundations, and they met up, in fact, even before this occurred, with Condoleezza Rice, when she was Secretary of State, and then subsequently with Hillary Clinton. So that again, that is the logic. You support Mubarak, you support the opposition to Mubarak, you create conflicts, and ultimately you dictate regime change. It's part of a very carefully thought out intelligence operative. It's very complex, and but I think that what we have to do is, first of all, we have to educate our grassroots, but we have to start pinpointing people in the left who are lying. Okay? Pinpointing the people in the left who are lying. And I would also say that we have to pinpoint governments who claim to be leftists, but who are in effect, I won't mention the names of the countries, but in effect obeying the imposition of neoliberal economic policies. Thank you very much.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank, Michel Schossodowski, für diese in Wortsinn radikale Analyse der US-Kriegsstrategien. Blick auf die Uhr, die Zeit ist etwas fortgeschritten, aber trotzdem würde ich sagen, Gelegenheit für zumindest 2 Fragen sollte sein. Also wenn sich jemand zum Mikrofon bewegen möchte, bitte, jetzt ist die Gelegenheit. Ja, bitte hier vorne links.
My name is Troll Schmidt, and I'm a U.S. Army anti-war veteran living in Copenhagen. I watch democracy all the time, and I had previously loved Amy Goodman. Please tell me, who funds Amy Goodman that we should be critical of?
I cannot answer that right now, but the information is available. It's major foundations, and they get a hell of a lot of money. I could say that very briefly. Was ist los da?
Vielleicht lassen wir Michel Schossodowski die Gelegenheit, die Frage zu beantworten, ne? Bitte.
Excuse me, but I heard someone criticize you for lying. Please say some more in your defense.
Nobody has accused me of lying so
I
far.
heard someone over here say that.
Well, then why doesn't that person go to the microphone then, and we can have some discussion?
I agree with you. Good.
I think anybody who wants to challenge what I've said, they can do so. I wish that somebody at least would speak out then, among the...
So, ich sehe jetzt aber jetzt war hier noch eine Wortmeldung in der dritten Reihe. Ich weiß nicht. So, bitte, jetzt auf der
Yeah,
rechten
I was
Seite.
the one who said you're talking bullshit. And if you have something to say, I think you should substantiate it and not throw around things that you really can't define. At least 3 times in your speech, you've said, I can't go into details. For example, countries that I don't want to say anything about, names that I don't want to name. We're in a place where you can say the name. So say the names if you have it.
Well, I can say the names, I just don't want to...
Well, say the goddamn names and don't beat around the bush, because you're making yourself suspicious.
The Brazilian government of Luiz Ignacio da Silva, faithful servant of the International Monetary Fund. Yeah, I mean, if that's what you want. I mean, there are other countries...
If you were in Brazil...
Please, we are not going to have a dialogue here. Let him answer the question
I've answered
straightforward.
your question. You asked... But I don't understand what is your question then? If you have a question, ask the question. Yeah?
You supposedly had proof that Democracy Now! Was funded by some sort of subversive sources. Well, here's a place. You're not in a place where you're not allowed to name names. If you say that, then we want to hear the names.
Listen, I didn't say anything about, I said that many of these organizations receive funds from the Ford Foundation, from the Rockefeller Foundation. You can go online and all this information is public. I don't, at the moment, in my notes, I don't have it. But I have it, if I consult my website, I'll find it for you. Okay? I can tell you that the World Social Forum initially was funded by the Ford Foundation. That is documented, and they ultimately they decided not to discontinue this support. It was also funded by the British government at one point, okay, during Tony Blair. Now, I'm not passing a judgment on the World Social Forum itself, because I think there's some very good people in there, but I think it is not possible to wage a campaign against Wall Street and then ask Wall Street, could you pay for our travel expenses? That is ultimately what is involved. And I also believe there's several alternative media which fall in that category. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are immediately co-opted, but their hands are tied.
Entschuldigung, noch mal kurz eine technische Ansage. Bitte guckt unbedingt zusammen. Also die Türen sind geschlossen, es kommt keiner mehr rein. Es sind immer noch so viele Plätze in den Reihen. Bitte rutscht auf, dass die Leute Platz nehmen können.
Hello, how's everyone out there? Well, I bring greetings from my family of Mumia Abu-Jamal, and I bring solidarity from our support and all of your support that we are here as one. So I have brought a speech from my father and one that I have wrote, and also a family petition for those that want to join the family's campaign to bring Mumia home. He is innocent, and we continue to go around and share our solidarity to the international support. I am here in Germany to show this. Well, I will start off with the first speech of my father. He gives greetings, friends, brothers, sisters, comrades. I greet you all through my son, Jamal, and thank you for your work to free those in American dungeons and to shut down the U.S. death house. We know that Red Rose spent time in prison in Bruchla, but I doubt she dreamed of the size and scope of what the American system of mass incarceration has come to be. Because he is my son, he has felt that sting, but he is free today, a survivor of that monster. I thank you for receiving him. You have asked about the righteous trend emerging in several states and what that portends for the future. History teaches us that righteous xenophobic forces arise in nations where economic anxiety heightens. We can see this quite clearly in nations facing austerity measures where social services like education, housing, and healthcare gets cut. We are seeing it in Greece with the emergence of Golden Dawn. We see it in England, in France, in the Nordic nations, and yes, in Germany. These forces draw people apart and utilizes fear and enmity to weaken the working class. That's why the rulers seek austerity. It serves their economic interests. For when people are divided and fighting each other, they cannot fight the system. For young people, it is especially important to build radical and resistant movements, for by so doing, they deny that energy to reactionary movements. And they also give hope to other social movements and activists to stand their ground. Young people must resist the call of austerity, supporters to turn inward and ignore what's happening in such countries. They must engage, build movements, create greater social cohesion to resist the ideology of austerity. I thank you all for your work and your support. On the move, Mumia Abu-Jamal. Thank you. Also, there is one message I would like to bring to Germany that I had when I visited my father on December the 7th, 2013. And one of the things that we want people to realize is that we are not accepting one of the lesser evils. Meaning he was offered death row, but that was only to satisfy a lesser evil of slow death row, which was sentence of life imprisonment. So, with that said, I wrote this speech, and it is titled, No to Slow Death Row. Universal greetings to all of you present, and to those that could not attend, their presence remains with us. However, I, Jamal, the son of Mumia Abu-Jamal, have brought a message from my dear father that I must share with all of you here in Germany, simply reminding everyone that he has not obtained any victory of any type and remains in a U.S. slow death row prison. Unfortunately, our adversaries are blatantly discrediting the continuous fight to save Mumia's life. Slow death row is a slap in our political faces from all races, castes, and class of the working people, from across the US, Europe, and abroad, that have put in years of hard work, fearless in resistance within this struggle to bring Mumia home. We must not stop and accept such malicious injustice towards my father Mumia, an innocent man, falsely persecuted to slow death row. Yes, even here in Germany, we must unite together across lands, oceans, and political agendas, and stand firm together and demand for Mumia's freedom. Today, resistance is more powerful than ever. We are more computer literate and technology advanced, that every spark of light together brings forth a spotlight of truth and strength and united. Life for many are taking in tolls within everyday events to enjoy freedom with loved ones, family, and reach common goals. Whereas Mumia, whom for the first time embraced his 26-year-old first grandson, my son Jamal, since he was born 26 years ago, never touched his grandfather. People, Mumia has been deliberately denied such liberties under the guise of corruption from the start, at the bloody hands of U.S. mendacious legal system and original District Attorney Ed Rendell, amongst other Philadelphia unsavory officials. Some has risen to enormous political power on this frame-up against Mumia that conspired and manufactured guilt knowingly to wrongfully place him initially on Pennsylvania death row for almost 30 years. For the people constantly challenging such rogue injustice of an innocent journalist, well known amongst the unfortunate and poor, we must stand together, firm and steadfast, having a voice against police brutality, racism, rogue acts of injustice against people of color, and the misfortunate dare report publicly such unsavory acts to the public, take undying love for the people. It is clear that he is innocent and took a stand against injustice. His adversaries refuse to acknowledge, instead wishes to bury on slow death row. We must not accept this blatant injustice. Take a stand with the first family of Mumia, and together we are a force that say no to slow death row. And together, free Mumia now. Sign the first family petition demanding Mumia freedom now. Thank you kindly for taking this stand with Mumia in solidarity. Jamal ibn Mumia. Take this time and express to people that the family have established a website, and it is freedom4mumia.org. This website was established to allow the international supporters to be able to be in contact with other groups that support us as well around the world. And it is ran by the family, and we are asking for you to deliver your questions and your thoughts and your messages that you want to give to Mumia that you may have given to others. We are here, and I have the family petition. It is on that website page that people can go to, freedom4mumia.org, and please support. This is the copy I'm reading. It's Mumia Abu-Jamal is innocent. Free Mumia now. Mumia Abu-Jamal is an innocent man. For almost 3 decades, he faced legal lynching. In December 2011, the Philadelphia DA and Fraternal Order of Police, backed by Edward Rendell, former Pennsylvania governor, Philadelphia mayor, and the DA who prosecuted Mumia, conceded defeat in trying to execute him. Mumia is now sentenced to slow death row, life imprisonment without parole. Life imprisonment is an outrage. Free Mumia now. Mumia's conviction for the shooting death of police officer Daniel Faulkner was a political and racist frame-up. Mumia was a spokesman for the Black Panther Party, exposed the murderous treatment of the MOVE organization, and was an award-winning journalist, the voice of the voiceless. From moments after the shootings, the police and prosecution manufactured Mumia's guilt and actively suppressed his innocence. evidence that someone else shot and killed Officer Faulkner. The notorious trial judge, Albert Sabo, a self-proclaimed racist and openly biased against Mumia, declared before the trial, "I'm going to help fry the nigger." All elements of due process, the right to a fair trial, were violated. Every part of the prosecution's case, witness testimony, Mumia's supposed confessions and ballistics, is a lie. The police, prosecution, and Justice Department colluded to secure Mumia's conviction and death sentence for a crime he did not commit, including hiding that the ranking officer on the scene, Inspector Afonso Giordano, was under federal investigation for police corruption. Mumia continues to be outspoken and truth-telling, and defiant, resistant to state repression and racial oppression. The state wants to silence and entomb for life this man who is known as a long-distance revolutionary. We stand with Mumia. Mumia's freedom is part of our struggle for justice and human liberation. We demand free Mumia now, release Mumia Abu-Jamal immediately from the hellholes of prisons. And you can get this petition on the website. It is freedom4mumia.org, and you can sign and join the struggle. This is the family. This is not affiliated with any legal or nothing. This is the family campaign to bring Mumia home. My father, he believes that the international support of the people will force the United States government to release him from the injustice incarceration. I would like to thank you all for having me here, and I have come all the way from America to let you know and see in human flesh that our struggle is real, and we stand in solidarity with all of the supporters. There is no voice or no question that will not be answered. Thank you, and have a great day at the convention.